So we have our first presenter now, Alexandra Jaffe from Cal State University, Long Beach, presenting about Corsican Spanish. I'm sorry, I'm obsessed. Here you are.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And there's a handout coming around, and there may or may not be one for everybody, but it doesn't really matter. You can follow without it. I just want to note and thank the funding from the Peripheral Multilingualism Project, which helped to support the research that I did here. So I'm going to take you, everybody said now for something completely different, so I'm going to take you to the French island of Corsica, where I've been doing field work for over 30 years. And while everybody on, can you hear me? No. This is good? Okay. So while everybody in Corsica speaks French, the heritage language of the island is Corsican, and you're going to be able to hear that it's closely related to Italian, and it's not mutually intelligible with French. So Corsica has undergone a process of language shift and revitalization, and the language shift took place under conditions that should be familiar to many of you, which is schooling, which took place in French and denigrated Corsican, out-migration and opportunity linked to out-migration, and the use of the French language. So starting in the 1970s, there was a significant language revitalization movement that started. And the main thing to sort of take account of here is that the schools were the core sites or the core focus of that language revitalization movement, as opposed to the families. And they were seeking to generalize the teaching of Corsican as well as to establish bilingual schools. So you can see on the right here just a very brief sociolinguistic snapshot of the island, where you can see approximately a third of the people on the island speak Corsican. Speakers are more heavily concentrated in older males. Approximately 60% evaluate themselves as good or quite good speakers of the language. And then crucially, only about 3% of Corsican children are socialized to use Corsican in the family. So family transmission is quite low. So I'm going to be looking at some bilingual schools where I've been working. And the bilingual schools were established in 1986. About 25%, 20-30% of children today are schooled in this method, where they are learning up to 50% in Corsican and up to 50% in French. It varies a little from school by school. The teachers use both languages, so it's one teacher, two languages, so they are modeling both bilingual practice and, I would also argue, a bilingual person. So the strategies, so schooling, if we think about the fact that only 3% of children are Corsican speakers, we're saying that there's an attempt in these bilingual schools to repair this sociolinguistic rupture and to do three things. And the first is to create new speakers, so bilingual schools in an effort to create new speakers. The second is to raise the status and legitimacy of Corsican, so to create parity with French, so there's an agenda there in the schools. And then there's another agenda, which is to establish Corsican as a privileged language, or to reinforce it as a privileged language of cultural identity. Now, the first and the third goals have some embedded tensions in them. And the first tension has to do with the fact that not all native speakers accept language learners as authentic, legitimate speakers. So they can hear school Corsican as inauthentic. And the second tension relates to the third goal, which is that the authoritarian nature of schooling comes into conflict with some of those affective and identity goals. And so the kind of poetic practice that I'm going to be describing to you, I think, helps to at least partially mediate those tensions. So the poetic form that I'm going to be talking about is called the Chjam'e Rispondi, or call and response. So it's a traditional improvisational poetic joust, and it has a specific form with a number of different rhyme schemes that you can see here. And it's a sung form of poetry rather than being spoken. And the way that it works is that the first poet sings a verse, And the second poet, so it's always in pairs, has to respond almost immediately. So the improvisation is pretty spectacular when you see it. Ideally, that second poet should take up the last line of what the first person said and then improvise from there. But sometimes it's really they pick up on the theme, but you must pick up on the theme. And it's characterized by a joking kind of light-hearted key, which in Corsican they refer to as amagagna. And so people are often taking each other to task or, just criticizing. They're saying things about where they come from or their poetic skill or their name or whatever it might be. So that's the kind of thing it is. And there are a lot of aesthetic criteria that are kind of applied to this. People are looking for, they're looking for cleverness, they're looking for humor, they're looking for form, whether poets, have easy versus not so easy rhymes. So the more difficult rhymes are the ones that are kind of prized. Now, I want to give you just a very, very brief glimpse of how this takes place in one of its traditional contexts of use, which is informal. You can see it's a cafe. And the person on the right there is Christophe Limongi, who's one of the teachers that I'm going to be talking about. So you'll see this come in I'll just give you a little sense of it. It's not subtitled, but you'll get a sense of what's going on. So he's directing this at another person in the room who you'll see come into the frame. Oops, sorry.
Quando canta di mondi, tutto ognuno qui sta sente. È vera la scrittura che è il più competente. Ma tu si smette anche un errore, cioè il più forte, non tocca attore.
Okay, so I'll stop there. And one of the things that he's saying to the young poet is he's saying, you're better at writing these things than you are at singing them, right? So it gives you a little bit of a sense of what it's like. So I did a research project in 2 bilingual schools, one which was taught by Christophe, and that's in Poetic. It was a very small, multi-age classroom in a village, and it was their 3rd year of working on the Chjam'e Rispondi. And the other class was the Bonafede school in the city of Ajaccio. It was with a 3rd grade teacher called Sonia Foti. And it was her first year trying this out. So while Christophe was a poet himself, Sonia was not, but her husband was one. So she was very familiar with the genre. And just to give you a little glimpse of, the geography, I lived at point A on the map. I would travel by car to point B, which is Poetic, and Ajaccio at point C. And the classes would compose poems that they directed at the other school. And over the course of 6 months, I would record their poems and physically then transport them to the other place. I'd play them back in audio or video, and then those kids would respond. So I was kind of the vector of the exchange. So the typical process, talk a little bit about what went on inside the pedagogical classroom. So first they'd get a call, and the call could come from the teacher, and you're going to see one of those in a moment, or the other class, and it would be read and sung out loud. There would then be some discussion of the content. So once they had understood the content, Christophe collected their ideas for the response, and usually the kids would propose 1 or 2 lines. They'd discuss them, he'd put them on the board. That could lead to further modifications, and once they were happy with the finished product, they would sing it, usually individually and collectively. Oh, sorry, I didn't press my button there. Okay. So, I want to show you an example of a call that was initiated by the teacher, and this is what you have on your handout. So what's the context? Once a week, they had an English teacher who visited the classroom, and she had complained to Christophe that the children had not been doing their English homework, and they hadn't been paying attention. So when she left, he turned to them, and he sang this verse. Right? So he's saying, you shouldn't be proud of what you're doing, you forgot to do your homework, and I got to conclude that you're donkeys, right? So it was their turn to respond. And with scaffolding from the teacher, they proposed, wrote, and performed a response, and you see the first verse there, right? We aren't donkeys, we're intelligent, we're gonna get good grades, and we won't just get one good grade. This one was their favorite because it contained the line about their heads exploding if they got too much homework from him. So we're going to take a little glimpse into that process by which they composed that verse. So that's where I'm most interested, not so much on the finished product, but what happens inside the classroom. So this you can follow along on your handout. It's starting approximately line 11, and you should be able to see, hopefully, the subtitles will guide you as well.
Allora, beh, se ci sono troppo duelli.
Mais je trouve, ça veut dire trop d'ouvert, on coulerait ou scaler. Ça veut dire qu'on n'avancera pas. On n'a pas de gauche.
Ma ha detto qualcosa che facevi che ha senso se
Non va exploser, mais jamais.
se ci sono troppo duelli, ma se l'esplode non diventa avanti, in futuro, dunque esploseranno i giardini. E gli ultimi? All'interno scaglieri, belli, portieri, castelli, medi, foresi.
Là, il faut descendre. Il faut aller là.
Là e?
Là, il faut aller.
Io niente, no?
Mais aggiungo uno.
No, ne voglio io.
Mais scambieremo di scuole, faremo in foulée.
Scambieremo di scuola. Ah, non come? Che poi non mi?
Noi scambieremo.
No, noi e scambieremo di scuola, faremo i foleri.
Mais je posso leggere.
Ti stiamo sempre.
Si deve impruvessare e banali fedeli. Se ci sarà troppo duello, spruzzeranno i cervelli. E scambieremo di scuola, faremo in fureli.
D'accordo.
Okay. So there are a lot of things we could say about this clip, but I just want to point to a couple. One of them is that there's a lot of teacher scaffolding. So one of the things that you might have noticed is him counting on the syllables on his hand, and all the kids do that. That's a practice that was introduced into the schools that no poets ever do, right? But you see them doing it as they go along. But there are lots of ways in which the scaffolding treats the children as practitioners with linguistic, poetic, and social competencies. You can see this in their making choices, discussion about making choices that marry form, aesthetics, and meaning. So on the linguistic side, there's the discussion of the tense of the verb to explode, and that's on lines 18 through 25. And in terms of content, there's Christophe's comment on lines 15 and 16, where there's been a proposal, and he says, let's go back to what Serena said, because it both makes sense and it's funny, right? So he's orienting them to the spirit of Amagana, right? The tone or the key of the Chjam'e Rispondi. There's another glimpse of socialization to practice that illustrates socialization. Sorry, my mouth is super dry. There's another glimpse of socialization to practice that indexes the kids having a kind of valued poetic stance and identity. So that takes place on lines 35 and 36. So in line 35, Lesia says, I think I've got one. I got a line, right? And the teacher comes right back to her and he says, but you need two. And one of the things that this alludes to is a recent shift in his guidelines. So he's saying you need to invent and think more like adult poets in couplets rather than single lines. So in other words, he's telling them you need to up your game. And in doing that, he's establishing an indexical link between this way of composing and an expert identity of poet. And he's positioning the children as being on a trajectory towards that identity and some kind of fuller linguistic expertise. So the exchange between the two schools culminated in a field trip where both schools traveled to a museum of anthropology in the center of the island. They exchanged their entire poetry and song cycle face to face. They participated in workshops about poetry and traditional instruments. They listened to the archives of Chjam'e Rispondi recordings from the 1930s, and they also were the audiences to an improvisational exchange between two well-known poets who had come to take part in the activities. And I'm going to have to unfortunately skip over the recording of that because of time. So there were also some important ways in which the children of Pedagogy were also positioned as poets and experts in future contexts of performance that I documented. So in the first, the teacher called the regional radio station. They had a Corsican language, call-in program. And he and the class performed the exchange that you have on the handout on air and live. So they were on the phone when they were doing that. Several months later, at a poetry festival for children, two of the kids from the class performed the same exchange in front of a live audience, this time with one of them taking the voice of the teacher and the other taking the voice of all the children. And after that festival, the children told, oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. After the festival, the children told me that they had really enjoyed both listening to the poets and seeing the houses of poets because they said, well, we are poets too, right? Finally, that radio call-in was downloaded by the teacher, and it was included in a video slideshow at the end of year parent night. So what we can note is the element of repetition and practice over time, the progressive appropriation of the piece of poetry by the children, and the fact that it became kind of an emblematic feature of the children's poetic repertoire, and by extension of their identity. And I won't be able to talk about what happened in the other class, but it was actually very, very similar. So through my attendance at all of these events, I saw a number of signs of the children's appropriation of the genre. And the first was their spontaneous practice. So if they were on a bus or they were with other kids, they'd just break out in song, singing one of their, a poem from their repertoire. Some of the kids in Christophe's class continued to improvise orally in Corsican and also, to his surprise, in French. Some of them kept personal poetry notebooks, and they wrote poems for friends and family and siblings. And Armand in Christophe's class said, "You can write poetry about anything at any moment. You can be inspired at any moment. That's why I carry a notebook and pen, just like our teacher," right? So some of the pedagogical implications, so I'll just talk just a little bit about linguistic learning. One of the things that they were learning a lot about was pronunciation, both standard pronunciation, but also pronunciations that were adapted to the exigencies of the poetic genre. So if you just look there in the example about the donkeys that you see on your handout, so for example, you have when he says that you are donkeys, in that line, boy, you, has two syllables. So, ki boi zi desumere, right? But in another line with the same word, boy, it's one syllable, again, to meet the number of syllables. Si de boi u professore, right? And elision that you find in Corsican, the example above that, where you say the example, it says there's no need to be proud. Un ci vuole a essere fieri, it's un ciole, right? So they had to elide in order to make it fit, and that also corresponds to Corsican practice. And other examples of linguistic learning included acquiring some agility with grammar, and always in the service of rhyme and meter. Okay, vocabulary learning, reinforcement of old vocabulary, learning new vocabulary, and I'm running short on time. And so familiarization with the type of knowledge needed to do the pronunciation. So I guess I want to just focus here on the sociocultural kind of implications and outcomes, because one of the things that we see with these kids is that they gained an experience of legitimate peripheral participation. They were in an expert, culturally valued practice, and even those kids who weren't the composers of those lines experienced some mastery, an experience of mastery through that scaffolding and rehearsal. So it's community, it's connection to a genre with historical and cultural depth, it's connection to actual practitioners, and the self-projection of themselves into the future. Social relations, they learned about this interactional ideal, which is the spirit of the magana, teasing but not going too far. And I think very importantly for thinking about what it means to speak a minority language, they learn to use that minority language in processes of social exchange, so exchange between themselves, between poets, between generations, and that last part between children, something that's very, very rare in a lot of minority language learning contexts where kids learn it in school, but they go out on the playground and they speak the dominant language. Okay, so just some, oops, sorry, I'll just go back and conclude really quickly. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. Poor PowerPoint skills. Okay. So I think I just want to emphasize to close that this really speaks to minority language revitalization as a social project. It's about creating and defining a new community of practice that involves the language and setting parameters for who's going to count as a legitimate speaker. So I think that this is contributing to that. And I also want to emphasize the collaborative nature of that practice, because in minority language contexts, the meaning of the language is that you do it, it has cultural value, and you do it with other people, and this is an example of doing something with others. And then I want to put in a pitch for thinking about linguistic competencies in these situations, not just as individual things, because sometimes when we measure individual competencies, individual speakers and even the society come up short. We're saying, oh, the kids don't speak this language, but rather in thinking about the language and language competency is distributed across the social body, which you can kind of see in this practice, where we have scaffolding and support and apprenticeship going from teacher to students, and even from older students to younger students. And then the last point is that, you know, sometimes I've been doing research in this area for a long time, and sometimes it's a pretty humorless affair. And there's a lot of pressure. There's identity pressure, there's social pressure to use that language, and if you don't use it, you're not considered to be authentic. And this pushed it into, I think, a much more lighthearted, ludic domain where kids were able to practice and perform and make mistakes and not be worried about those errors and just kind of celebrate what they were able to do. Okay, thanks.